When Thomas Anderson walked into his daughter's school that afternoon, covered in sawdust and wood stains, parents turned their heads and whispered. Little did they know that his rough carpenter's hands were about to craft a moment his daughter would remember forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a crisp autumn morning in Maple Valley, a charming town tucked away in the evergreen forests of Oregon. The maple trees that lined Main Street were ablaze with orange and crimson leaves, and the morning fog was just beginning to lift, revealing a sky that promised a perfect October day. The rhythmic sound of power tools and the sweet scent of freshly cut wood drifted from Anderson Custom Woodworking, where Thomas Anderson had already been hard at work since dawn. Tom, as everyone in town knew him, stood at his workbench carefully sanding the edges of what would soon become a handcrafted dining table. Sawdust clung to his faded flannel shirt and well-worn work boots, and his graying temples were dusted with fine wood particles that had escaped his safety goggles. His workshop was a testament to his craft, walls lined with carefully organized tools, some passed down through generations, others earned through years of dedication to his trade. Half-finished projects and smooth wooden planks waited patiently for his skilled hands to transform them into pieces that would become family heirlooms. Through the window of his workshop, he could see his daughter Sophie's favorite climbing tree, its branches now nearly bare. The tree housed the first project they had ever worked on together, a small birdhouse that, despite its slightly crooked roof, had become home to countless families of chickadees over the years. Tom smiled at the memory of Sophie's tiny hands helping him hold the pieces together, her face scrunched in concentration. The morning light streamed through the workshop's windows, creating dancing patterns of shadow and light across the sawdust-covered floor. The air was thick with the distinct aroma of cedar, oak, and pine, a smell that had become as much a part of Tom as his own skin. His latest commission, an elaborate set of built-in bookshelves for the town library, sat nearly finished in the corner, waiting for its final coat of varnish. In the small office attached to his workshop, a calendar hung on the wall, today's date circled in bright red marker with Sophie's unmistakable handwriting. Dad's presentation, 2 p.m. The sight made his stomach tighten slightly. He'd been so focused on completing his current projects that he'd almost forgotten about the school's career day, where parents would share their professions with the class. The morning's quiet was broken by the sound of running feet and the workshop door bursting open. Sophie bounded in, her dark hair in two slightly uneven braids, wearing her favorite overalls, the ones with little wooden rulers embroidered on the pocket, a birthday gift from her dad. Her backpack, covered in stickers of various tools, her own creative edition, bounced against her back as she navigated the familiar path through the workshop. "Dad, you didn't forget about today, right?" Sophie's eyes sparkled with excitement as she carefully avoided the stacks of lumber and works in progress. Unlike some of her friends who shied away from their parents' workplaces, Sophie had grown up loving the workshop, learning the names of tools and types of wood like other kids learn their ABCs. "How could I forget?" Tom replied, setting down his sanding block and kneeling to her level. "It's only been mentioned about 100 times this week." He playfully tweaked one of her braids, leaving a small smudge of sawdust that made her giggle. "Promise you'll tell them about the treehouse you built for the Williams family?" Sophie bounced on her toes. "And maybe about how you fixed Mrs. Wells's antique rocking chair when everyone else said it couldn't be saved?" Tom nodded, trying to mask his nervousness about speaking in front of a room full of professionals. "Sure thing, sweetheart. Though I'm not sure everyone will find wood and nails as exciting as you do." "Are you kidding? You make magic with wood, Dad? Like that secret compartment you built into Dr. Garcia's desk. That was like something from a spy movie." Sophie's enthusiasm was contagious, and Tom felt some of his anxiety melt away. The school bus honked outside, its yellow form visible through the workshop windows. Sophie quickly hugged her father, not minding the sawdust that now dusted her own clothes. "Don't be late," she called over her shoulder as she raced out, her backpack bouncing with each step. Tom watched her go, then turned back to his work, the weight of the afternoon's presentation settling back on his shoulders. He looked down at his calloused hands marked with countless small scars and permanent stains from years of woodworking. These were hands that could turn raw lumber into beautiful furniture. But would they be enough to impress a room full of parents with clean suits and prestigious careers? The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting longer shadows through the workshop as Tom immersed himself in his craft, trying to keep his mind off the approaching afternoon. He had a few more hours to finish his current project before he needed to head to the school. Just a few more hours before he'd have to step out of his comfortable world of wood and tools and into a very different kind of challenge. The gentle whir of Tom's lathe filled the workshop as he carefully shaped a decorative spindle for his latest project. Years of experience guided his hands with an almost unconscious precision, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, when to ease back, when to pivot. Around him, the organized chaos of his workspace told the story of a man who had dedicated his life to his craft. Custom-built storage solutions lined the walls, evidence of both his skill and practicality. Each chisel, saw, and plane had its place in the hand-carved wooden holders he'd designed himself. Strips of various hardwoods hung in carefully labeled sections: maple, oak, cherry, walnut. The floor beneath his feet was worn smooth from decades of footsteps, marking the paths he took thousands of times between his workbench, tools, and machinery. Tom paused his work to wipe the sweat from his brow with his forearm, inadvertently adding another smudge of sawdust to his already dusty face. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found their calling early in life and never looked back. His strong hands, marked with the occasional scar and perpetually embedded with fine wood particles, could feel the grain of wood like others read Braille. Every nick and callus told a story. The deep cut on his left thumb from his first major commission, the burn mark on his palm from steam-bending wood for a rocking chair, the slight crook in his right pinky from a workshop accident years ago. Through the window he caught sight of Mr. Peterson picking up his restored antique cabinet, and memories flooded back of the day he'd first chosen this path. He'd been just 19, working odd jobs when he'd helped an old carpenter restore his great-grandmother's hope chest. The way the old man's hands had moved across the wood, knowing exactly where to repair, how to bring the piece back to life, it had awakened something in Tom. That same night, he'd enrolled in a woodworking apprenticeship program, and the rest was history. Now, 26 years later, Anderson Custom Woodworking had become a cornerstone of Maple Valley. The workshop itself was a converted barn that still retained its rustic charm, though Tom had gradually modernized it with better lighting, proper ventilation, and state-of-the-art tools. Yet he'd kept the original exposed beams, their aged wood serving as a daily reminder of the craftsmanship of those who came before him. The wall behind his main workbench displayed a carefully arranged collection of his most precious possessions, tools inherited from his mentor. Among them hung the first hammer he'd ever owned, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and beside it, a child-sized tool belt that Sophie had outgrown, but he couldn't bear to take down. As he worked, Tom's mind wandered to the presentations that would happen later that day. He knew the other parents who would be there. Dr. Garcia, the architect who designed modern homes for wealthy clients in Portland. Mrs. Wells, the school principal with her doctorate in education. Lawyers, doctors, and business executives who wore suits instead of sawdust, who worked with computers instead of calluses. The sound of the bell from the workshop's front door interrupted his thoughts. "Just a minute," he called out, quickly shutting off the lathe and brushing sawdust from his clothes, a futile gesture that had become a habit. As he stepped into the front office, he found himself face-to-face with Mrs. Williams, Sophie's teacher. "Mr. Anderson," she smiled warmly. "I just wanted to stop by and confirm you'll be joining us this afternoon for the presentations. Sophie hasn't talked about anything else all week." Tom nodded, unconsciously rubbing his hands on his work apron. "Yes, ma'am. Though I'm not sure my talk about woodworking will be as interesting as hearing about designing skyscrapers or performing surgery." Mrs. Williams's eyes wandered around the office, taking in the photos of Tom's finished pieces, each one telling its own story of creativity and craftsmanship. "You'd be surprised, Mr. Anderson. In a world of mass production and virtual reality, there's something special about someone who can create beautiful things with their own hands. The children could use more exposure to real craftsmanship. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As she left, Tom returned to his workshop, her words echoing in his mind. He looked down at his current project, a music box he was crafting for Sophie's upcoming birthday. His fingers traced the dovetail joints he'd cut by hand, each one perfect from years of practice. The lid would have an inlaid design of maple and walnut, creating a pattern of falling leaves. It wasn't computer-designed or machine-made. It carried the small imperfections that made handcrafted pieces unique, that gave them soul. The wall clock, one he'd made himself with Sophie's help, showed it was nearly noon. In just a few hours, he'd have to stand in front of a room full of professionals and talk about his life's work. He thought about changing into cleaner clothes, but a glance at his packed schedule showed 3 more clients coming to discuss custom pieces before the presentation. There wouldn't be time to go home and change. Tom sighed and returned to his lathe. At least here, in his workshop, everything made sense. Wood didn't judge you by your appearance or your education. It only cared about skill, patience, and respect for the craft. As the lathe spun back to life, he couldn't help but wonder how those same values would translate to a room full of 8-year-olds and their accomplished parents. The late morning sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows as Tom checked his phone for what felt like the 100th time. 3 text messages from Sophie lit up the screen. "Don't forget your project's photos. Can you bring that cool piece of burled maple to show everyone? Remember, room 204 at 2. Tom smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, even as anxiety crept into his stomach. He'd spent the previous evening putting together a small portfolio of his work, carefully selecting photos that might interest the children. The elaborate treehouse he'd built for the Williams family, complete with secret trapdoors and a rope bridge, the restoration of the historic carousel horses for the town square, the custom puppet theater he'd made for the children's library. As he flipped through the photos on his tablet, sawdust-covered fingers leaving slight smudges on the screen, the workshop door chimed again. Tom looked up to see Mr. Thompson, one of his regular clients, rushing in with a panicked expression. "Tom, thank goodness you're here," Mr. Thompson said, running a hand through his silver hair. "The antique dining table, my wife's family heirloom, there's been an accident. Our son was practicing his baseball swing inside the house and—" He trailed off, his face pale. Tom's heart sank. He knew the table well, a magnificent piece from the 1890s that he'd restored the previous year. It had taken weeks of careful work to bring it back to its original glory. "How bad is it?" "The corner's completely shattered and there's a crack running halfway down the leg. My wife's beside herself. Her grandmother brought that table over from Italy." Mr. Thompson wrung his hands. "I know it's short notice, but is there any chance you could take a look? Today?" Tom glanced at the clock. 11:30 a.m. The school presentation was at 2 p.m. His mind raced through calculations. At least an hour to drive to the Thompsons' house and assess the damage. Another hour. If he needed to bring the table back to the workshop, not counting the time needed to gather his tools and materials. "Please," Mr. Thompson added. "My wife's family is coming this weekend for our anniversary dinner. That table has been the centerpiece of every family gathering for 4 generations." Tom felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Sophie, her face beaming with pride as she told her classmates about her dad's work. But he also thought about what he'd taught her about craftsmanship and responsibility, about how every piece of furniture carried memories and stories, how preserving those stories was part of a carpenter's sacred duty. "Let me make a quick call," Tom said, stepping into his office. He dialed Mrs. Williams's number, his fingers leaving dusty prints on the phone. "Mrs. Williams? Tom Anderson here. I've got a bit of an emergency with a client's family heirloom." He explained the situation, trying to keep the stress from his voice. "I'll still make it to the presentation, but I might be cutting it close. Could you possibly put me toward the end of the schedule?" There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. I'll put you last on the list, but please try not to be too late, Sophie's been talking about this all week." After hanging up, Tom turned to Mr. Thompson. "All right, let me grab my restoration kit, but we need to leave right now." As Tom gathered his tools, selecting specific chisels and clamps that might be needed, he sent a quick text to Sophie. "Got an emergency repair, but I promise I'll be there. Save me a seat." Her reply came instantly. "You're going to be amazing, Dad." Loading his tools into his old pickup truck, the word Anderson Custom Woodworking still visible through years of dust on the door, Tom tried to push down his growing anxiety. He'd worked under pressure before, tight deadlines, complex repairs, demanding clients. But something about standing in front of a room full of parents and children, trying to explain why his work mattered, felt more daunting than any restoration project. Mr. Thompson climbed into the passenger seat, clutching a piece of the broken table wrapped in a cloth napkin. As they pulled out of the workshop driveway, Tom caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror, sawdust in his hair, a smudge of wood stain on his cheek, his well-worn flannel shirt bearing the marks of the morning's work. There would definitely be no time to clean up before the presentation now. The truck rumbled down Main Street, past the storefronts where his handiwork could be seen everywhere. The hand-carved sign for the bakery, the custom display cases in the antique shop, the restored wooden horse in front of the toy store. Each piece held a story, a challenge overcome, a problem solved with patience and skill. As they turned onto Mountain View Road toward the Thompsons' house, Tom's phone buzzed again. Another text from Sophie. "Dad! Dr. Garcia just showed his blueprints for a huge building in Portland. Can't wait for you to show everyone your work too." Tom gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the familiar roughness of his calloused hands against the smooth leather. He had just over 2 hours to assess the damage, figure out a solution, and somehow make it to the school presentation. The weight of both responsibilities pressed down on him as heavy as the oak beams he'd lifted that morning. But then he remembered something his old mentor used to say. "Wood tells you what it needs, if you know how to listen." Same goes for life. Sometimes you just need to trust your hands and let them lead the way. Taking a deep breath, Tom pressed down on the accelerator. He had a broken table to fix and a daughter's pride to live up to. Somehow he'd find a way to do both. Thompson's elegant colonial house came into view as Tom's truck climbed the winding driveway. Mrs. Thompson was already waiting on the front porch, wringing her hands in a way that reminded Tom of countless other clients facing furniture emergencies. As he stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel, he could see the worry etched across her face. "Oh, Tom, thank goodness," she called out, hurrying down the steps. "I don't know what we would have done if you couldn't come. The table, it's been in my family for so long." Her voice cracked slightly as she led them through the house to the dining room. The moment Tom saw the table, his experienced eye assessed the damage. The baseball had caught the corner perfectly, shattering not just the edge but sending a spiral of cracks through one of the ornately carved legs. Pieces of splintered wood lay scattered on the polished hardwood floor, some no bigger than matchsticks. Tom knelt down, running his fingers along the fracture lines, reading the story of the impact through touch. "The good news," he said, carefully picking up a larger fragment, "is that this is solid walnut. Old growth, probably from northern Italy. Wood this dense can be repaired if you know what you're doing." He checked his phone quickly. 12:15 p.m. The presentation felt both too close and impossibly far away. Tom spread out his tools on a work mat, the familiar ritual helping to focus his mind. "Mr. Thompson, I'll need your help. Could you gather all the fragments you can find, even the smallest ones? Mrs. Thompson, do you have any white vinegar? It'll help clean the old glue residue." As the Thompsons hurried to help, Tom began the delicate work of assessing each broken piece. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, sorting fragments by grain pattern and location. Years of experience had taught him to see the hidden story in each piece of wood. Where it had grown, how it had been cut, what stresses it had endured over the decades. Time seemed to blur as he worked. The background faded away. The nervous hovering of the Thompsons, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. even his own anxiety about the upcoming presentation. There was only the wood, the tools, and the puzzle before him. His phone buzzed again at 1:05 p.m. Another text from Sophie. "Mrs. Williams says you'll be last to present. I told everyone you're doing something really important." Tom's stomach tightened. He looked at the partially repaired table leg, then at the scattered tools and supplies around him. The major structural work was done, but the detailed carving needed to match the original pattern would take time he didn't have. Mrs. Thompson appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. "How's it going?" she asked softly, trying to mask her concern. "The structural repair is nearly complete," Tom explained, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "I've managed to reattach all the major pieces and reinforce the joint, but the decorative carving—" He gestured to the intricate grapevine pattern that wound around the table leg, now interrupted by the repair work. "But it's stable? Safe to use?" Mr. Thompson asked. Tom nodded. "The leg is actually stronger now than it was before. I've reinforced it internally with a hardwood dowel, but it won't match the other legs perfectly until I can complete the carving work." He glanced at his phone again, 1:25 p.m. His heart raced as he realized he'd have to make a choice. He could stay and finish the detailed carving work, making the repair virtually invisible but missing Sophie's presentation day entirely. Or he could leave now, getting to the school just in time but leaving the table's aesthetic restoration incomplete. The weight of the decision pressed down on him as heavily as the ancient walnut table he was trying to save. His hands, covered in wood glue and sawdust, trembled slightly as he reached for his phone to text Sophie. But before he could type a message, Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "Mr. Anderson, the structural repair is what matters most. The carved details. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow. The family dinner isn't until Saturday." Tom looked up at her, surprised by the understanding in her voice. She smiled gently. "My grandmother used to say that family heirlooms are important because they carry our stories. Well, now this table has a new story, about a dedicated craftsman who rushed here to save it, and about his daughter who's waiting for him at school." Relief flooded through Tom as he began quickly but carefully packing his tools. "I'll come back first thing tomorrow morning to finish the carving. The glue needs time to cure completely anyway." As he hurried out to his truck, Mrs. Thompson called after him. "Good luck with the presentation. And thank you, not just for fixing the table, but for showing us what real craftsmanship means." The truck's engine roared to life as Tom checked the time one last time, 1:35 p.m. The school was 20 minutes away in good traffic. He'd have just enough time to get there, but absolutely no chance to clean up or change clothes. His shirt was covered in wood glue, his jeans dusted with sawdust, and his hands bore the marks of the morning's work and the emergency repair. As he drove, weaving through traffic as carefully as he could, Tom's mind raced. What would the other parents think when they saw him walk in looking like this? What would Sophie think? He caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror, a smudge of wood glue on his cheek, sawdust in his hair. His appearance a stark contrast to the suits and professional attire he knew would fill the school auditorium. But then he remembered the way Sophie's eyes lit up whenever she visited his workshop, how she never cared about the sawdust or the wood stains. To her, these marks were badges of honor, signs of problems solved and things created. He just hoped the other parents and children would see it the same way. The digital clock on Tom's truck dashboard seemed to mock him as he navigated through Maple Valley's winding streets. 1:47 p.m. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, still bearing traces of walnut stain from the morning's work. Each red light felt like an eternity, each slow-moving car in front of him another obstacle between him and his promise to Sophie. A memory flashed through his mind. Sophie at age 5, tears streaming down her face because he'd missed her first ballet recital due to a deadline on a major project. He'd promised himself then that he'd never let work come before her big moments again. Yet here he was, cutting it desperately close, his truck cab filled with the sharp smell of wood glue and the lingering dust from the Thompsons' emergency repair. At the fourth red light in a row, Tom finally had a moment to really look at himself in the rearview mirror. His reflection made him wince. The morning's sawdust had mixed with sweat and wood glue to create a paste that clung to his hair and clothes. His favorite flannel shirt bore the battle scars of the day, fresh glue stains on the sleeves, a small tear from catching it on a splinter of the Thompsons' table, and a constellation of wood stains that would never wash out. His jeans weren't much better, and his steel-toed boots were covered in a fine layer of sawdust that puffed up with each movement. "Oh, God," he muttered, attempting to brush some of the sawdust from his shirt. The gesture only succeeded in smearing a glob of half-dried wood glue across his chest. The small first aid kit he kept in the glove compartment offered up a few moist towelettes, but they seemed laughably inadequate against the day's accumulated grime. The clock now read 1:52 p.m. The school was still 10 minutes away in normal traffic, and the afternoon parents' rush had already begun. Tom's phone buzzed with another text from Sophie. "Where are you, Dad? Mrs. Williams is starting the last few presentations." His heart sank as he noticed movement up ahead, the unmistakable red and white stripes of construction barriers. A road crew was repaving part of Maple Street, forcing all traffic into a single lane. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another group of workers whose jobs involved dust, tools, and making things with their hands was now preventing him from getting to the school on time. As the line of cars inched forward, Tom's mind raced through alternatives. He could park a few blocks away and run, but in his steel-toed boots, that would probably take longer than waiting in traffic. He could call Mrs. Williams again, but he'd already pushed his luck by asking to go last. The thought of Sophie sitting there watching the door, waiting for him to arrive. The radio crackled with a local news update. And for those heading downtown, expect delays on Maple Street due to emergency road work. Consider taking Cedar Avenue as an alternate route. Cedar Avenue. Tom's eyes widened as he remembered the shortcut through the old lumber mill property. It wasn't strictly a public road, but he delivered furniture there often enough that the security guard knew him. Without hesitation, he flicked on his turn signal and pulled out of the crawling traffic line. The truck bounced along the gravel access road, past stacks of lumber that reminded him of his own workshop. The security guard recognized his truck and waved him through with a friendly nod. Tom's pulse quickened as he realized he might just make it. But as he emerged onto Watson Street just 2 blocks from the school, the reality of his appearance hit him again full force. He caught sight of other parents walking toward the school, Dr. Garcia in his tailored suit, carrying what looked like architectural blueprints. A woman in a crisp business suit who he recognized as a local judge. Another parent in surgical scrubs, presumably coming straight from the hospital. Tom pulled into the school parking lot at 1:58 p.m., his truck raising a small cloud of dust as he parked. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, as panic truly set in. In all his rush to get here, he hadn't really processed what he was about to do. He was going to walk into a room full of professionals looking like he'd just crawled out of a sawmill explosion. His calloused hands, marked with fresh scratches from the Thompsons' table repair, would be on display as he tried to explain his craft to a room full of children and their well-groomed parents. The school bell rang, its sound carrying across the parking lot. 2 p.m. He was technically on time, but now that he was here, his legs felt too heavy to move. Through the windshield, he could see more parents entering the building, their appearances immaculate, their presentations probably filled with impressive PowerPoint slides and professional achievements. His phone buzzed one final time. Sophie again. "Dad? Please tell me you're close. You're going to be amazing." That heart emoji next to the hammer. It was so perfectly Sophie. At that moment, Tom remembered something he always told her when she was nervous about trying something new. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. Taking a deep breath, Tom grabbed his tablet with the project photos and the small piece of burled maple Sophie had asked him to bring. As he stepped out of the truck, a cloud of sawdust followed him. He straightened his shoulders. He might not look like the other parents, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. After all, he was here to talk about working with his hands, about creating something real from raw materials. Perhaps looking like he'd just stepped out of his workshop was exactly right. Still, as he walked toward the school entrance, leaving dusty footprints on the clean sidewalk, his heart pounded with each step. He was about to find out if Sophie's pride in his work was enough to overcome the stark contrast between him and the other parents. The heavy glass doors of Maple Valley Elementary swung open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of air-conditioned air that made the sawdust on Tom's clothes dance in the fluorescent lighting. The normally quiet hallway echoed with voices drifting from the school auditorium, where the career presentations were well underway. The sound of confident, professional voices mixed with children's excited chatter made his stomach tighten. Tom's steel-toed boots squeaked against the freshly waxed floors, leaving faint, dusty footprints that made him wince. The school's janitor, Mr. Rivera, was moping nearby and gave him a sympathetic look. "Rough day at the workshop, Mr. Anderson?" "Emergency repair," Tom managed to explain, trying unsuccessfully to brush more sawdust from his shirt. A family heirloom. The hallway walls were lined with student artwork and class projects, including, he noticed with a sudden warmth in his chest, a display about community heroes, where Sophie had drawn a picture of him in his workshop. The crayon version of himself stood proudly next to a workbench, wearing an apron covered in colorful shapes that were presumably meant to be wood shavings. As he approached the auditorium doors, he could hear someone speaking about investment banking through the heavy wood panels. The voice was polished, confident, filled with terms like portfolio management and market analysis. Tom glanced down at his own hands, where a splinter from the Thompson's table was still lodged under his thumbnail. Through the small window in the door, he could see the audience. The auditorium was arranged with children seated cross-legged on the floor near the stage, while parents and teachers occupied chairs behind them. Even from this distance, he could spot Sophie in the front row, periodically turning to scan the doors, her legs bouncing with nervous energy. The assembled parents looked exactly as he'd feared. Dr. Garcia sat near the front, his architect's portfolio balanced professionally on his knee, his silver-framed glasses catching the stage lights. Several rows back, he recognized the chief surgeon from the regional hospital, still in pristine scrubs. Business suits, professional dresses, and pressed uniforms filled the rows, creating a sea of success and respectability that made his sawdust-covered flannel feel like a costume at a formal party. Mrs. Williams stood at the podium, her voice carrying clearly, "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, for that fascinating look into the world of international finance. Next, we'll hear about the art of craftsmanship from Sophie Anderson's father." Tom's hand froze on the door handle. Through the window, he watched Sophie's head snap around once more, her eyes searching the back of the room. He could see Mrs. Williams also glancing toward the doors, a flicker of concern crossing her face as she prepared to potentially skip to the next presenter. In that moment of hesitation, Tom caught his reflection in the narrow window. The afternoon sun streaming through the auditorium's high windows highlighted every speck of dust in his hair, every stain on his clothes. There was even a cobweb clinging to his shoulder, probably from crawling under Thompson's table. He looked less like a presenter and more like someone who should be fixing the auditorium's backstage equipment. But then he saw Sophie half rising from her spot on the floor, her eyes wide with worry as she searched for him. He thought of the pride in her voice that morning, of all the times she'd sat in his workshop watching him work, asking questions about different types of wood and joints. He remembered her face lighting up when he'd taught her to sand her first piece of wood, how she'd insisted on keeping the sawdust-covered dress she'd worn that day, declaring it her special workshop outfit. Taking a deep breath that smelled of wood glue and honest work, Tom pushed open the auditorium door. The hinges creaked slightly, drawing every eye in the room toward him. He could hear the soft gasps, see the raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. A few parents in pressed business attire shifted in their seats, subtly moving away as if his sawdust might somehow drift their way. But before the weight of all those stares could crush him, he heard Sophie's voice ring out, "Dad, you made it." Her face broke into a smile that could have lit up the whole town, and she bounced on her toes, pointing excitedly to where Mrs. Williams stood at the podium. As Tom made his way down the aisle, he could hear the whispers, "Is that really a presenter? Couldn't he have cleaned up a bit? What happened to him?" Each step felt like walking through molasses, each whisper like a tiny pin pricking his confidence. But then he caught Dr. Garcia leaning forward, studying him with unexpected interest, and Mrs. Williams offering an encouraging smile from the podium. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement as he passed her, and she reached out to grab his hand, not caring about the wood stains or the roughness of his calluses. "Did you save the table, Dad?" She whispered loudly enough for nearby parents to hear, causing a ripple of curious murmurs. Tom squeezed her hand gently before continuing to the stage steps, each footfall leaving a dusty print on the polished wood. As he climbed onto the stage, the bright lights illuminating every imperfection in his appearance, he heard one clear whisper from somewhere in the middle rows. "That's the man who restored my grandmother's rocking chair, the one no one else would even try to fix." The comment hung in the air as Tom reached the podium, the microphone waiting like a judge ready to pass a sentence. He placed his tablet down, along with the piece of burled maple that had somehow survived the chaos of his day, and turned to face the sea of expectant faces. In that moment, standing under the bright lights with sawdust drifting from his clothes like snow, Tom Anderson was about to discover whether a lifetime of craftsmanship could bridge the gap between his world of wood and nails and this audience of professionals and their children. The microphone let out a soft squeal of feedback as Tom cleared his throat, causing several parents to wince. He adjusted the mic stand, leaving a faint smudge of wood stain on its chrome finish. The heavy silence in the auditorium was broken only by the soft whir of ceiling fans stirring the sawdust that still clung to his clothes. Tom began, his voice catching. He glanced down at his tablet, screen now partially obscured by a fine layer of dust. The carefully prepared photos of his work seemed inadequate now, faced with this audience of accomplished professionals. A drop of sweat mixed with sawdust trickled down his temple. From the front row, Sophie gave him 2 enthusiastic thumbs up, nearly bouncing in her seated position. But behind her, he could see parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One mother in an expensive suit discreetly brushed at her sleeve, though she was nowhere near Tom's fallout zone of wood particles. "As Mrs. Williams mentioned," he started again, his voice stronger this time, "I'm Sophie's dad, Tom Anderson. He paused, the word Carpenter suddenly feeling small compared to the impressive titles that had preceded him. Investment banker, architect, neurosurgeon. His hands, rough and marked with the day's labor, gripped the podium edges. A child's voice piped up from the crowd. "Why are you all dirty?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the audience. Tom saw Mrs. Williams start to stand, presumably to quiet the question, but he held up a hand to stop her. The honest curiosity in the child's voice had actually helped break the tension in his chest. "Well," Tom said, managing a smile, "I had an emergency repair this afternoon. A family's treasured dining table, one that had been passed down through 4 generations, was accidentally damaged. They needed help saving something precious to them." He noticed Dr. Garcia leaning forward slightly, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine interest. A few other parents straightened in their seats. "I'm what you might call a custom woodworker," Tom continued, unconsciously rubbing his hands together, sending a small shower of sawdust onto the podium. "But really, I'm more of a problem solver, a keeper of stories, sometimes even a bit of a time traveler." The confused looks from both children and adults spurred him to explain, but before he could, his tablet screen went dark. As he reached to wake it, a blob of half-dried wood glue on his finger smeared across the screen, making the situation even worse. Sophie's voice rang out clear and proud. "Show them the special wood, Dad." The one with the swirls. Grateful for the suggestion, Tom reached for the piece of burled maple he'd brought. But as he lifted it, his nervousness caused him to fumble. The beautiful piece of wood slipped from his fingers, hitting the stage with a loud clatter and rolling toward the edge. Several parents gasped. Tom lunged for the wood, his boots squeaking on the polished stage floor, nearly losing his balance. More sawdust billowed from his clothes, creating a small cloud that drifted over the first row of children, causing a few sneezes and giggles. Mrs. Williams stepped forward, perhaps to suggest they move on to the next presenter, but Sophie was already on her feet. Without hesitation, she bounded onto the stage, retrieved the fallen piece of wood, and handed it back to her father with a bright smile. "It's okay, Dad," she said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Remember what you always tell me? Sometimes the best stories start with mistakes." A few parents chuckled, but this time the sound was warmer, more understanding. Tom looked at his daughter, standing there completely unfazed by his dusty appearance or his awkward start, and felt something shift inside him. She wasn't embarrassed by his work-worn appearance or his lack of professional polish. To her, every speck of sawdust was a badge of honor, every stain a story of something created or preserved. "Thanks, Princess," he said softly, then turned back to the audience with renewed confidence. "My daughter's right. In my workshop, mistakes aren't failures, they're opportunities. Every piece of wood has its own character, its own story. Sometimes the most beautiful grain patterns come from what others might see as flaws." He held up the piece of burled maple, its swirling patterns catching the stage lights. "Like this piece here, what looks like a mistake in the wood's growth actually creates something unique and valuable. Nature's way of turning an imperfection into art." A small hand shot up from the audience. "Is that why you're covered in sawdust? Because you were making something beautiful?" Tom smiled, finally feeling the knot in his stomach begin to loosen. "Actually, this sawdust tells the story of my whole day. Some of it's from the cabinet I was building this morning. Some are from the family table I just finished repairing. Each bit of dust represents something fixed, something created, something preserved." He glanced at Sophie, who was still standing beside him, beaming with pride. "And you know what? I think it's time I told you all about what really happens in a woodworker's workshop. Because it's not just about cutting boards and hammering nails. It's about making magic from trees, solving puzzles in 3 dimensions. And sometimes," he winked at his daughter, "even traveling through time." The awkward silence from earlier had transformed into something different, an anticipatory hush as both children and parents leaned forward slightly in their seats. Even Dr. Garcia had taken off his glasses, cleaning them with focused interest as if preparing to see something new. Tom reached for his tablet one more time, determined to share his world with these people who suddenly seemed less intimidating. After all, he had something they might never have experienced. The satisfaction of creating something lasting with his own hands, of turning raw nature into functional art, of preserving stories in wood and craft. Sophie squeezed his hand once more before hopping back to her spot in the front row, leaving small dusty footprints on the stage. As Tom looked out at the waiting faces, he realized that maybe, just maybe, his sawdust-covered appearance wasn't a disadvantage after all. Perhaps it was the most authentic way to tell his story. "Let me show you something special," Tom said, finally managing to clean his tablet screen with the least dusty corner of his shirt. He held up the burled maple again, this time with steady hands. "This piece of wood is like a time capsule. Each ring tells us about a year in this tree's life, when there were droughts, when there was plenty of rain, even when forest fires passed through." A ripple of interest moved through the audience as he tilted the wood under the stage lights, revealing the intricate patterns that swirled like marble beneath its surface. Even the parents who had been checking their phones now looked up with curiosity. "But what makes this piece truly special isn't just its beauty," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's what it teaches us about seeing value in unexpected places. Most lumber mills would have discarded this section because of these unusual growths. But to a woodworker, these imperfections create some of the most beautiful patterns in nature." A small hand shot up from the middle of the children's section. It was Jason, one of Sophie's classmates. "Did you build the giant tree house at Billy Williams' house? The one with the secret doorway?" Tom smiled, grateful for the question. "I did. And would you like to know a secret about that tree house?" The children leaned forward eagerly. "Every single piece of wood in that tree house tells a story. The curved railings? They're made from branches that grew that way naturally. The secret door? It's built using wood from an old barn that stood in this town for over 100 years. He swiped a photo on his tablet, holding it up. The image showed the treehouse, its organic lines blending perfectly with the old oak tree that supported it. Several children gasped in recognition. "You see, woodworking isn't just about building things," Tom explained, warming to his subject. "It's about listening to the stories wood wants to tell. Every piece has its own character, its own history. When I'm working on a project, I'm not just cutting and shaping. I'm having a conversation with the material." Dr. Garcia raised his hand, surprising everyone. "Mr. Anderson, I believe you restored the conference table in my office. The one that was damaged in the flood last year? I've always wondered how you matched the color so perfectly." Tom's face lit up. "That table was a fascinating challenge. The key was understanding that wood ages like we do. It develops character over time. I couldn't just apply new stains to match the old. I had to recreate decades of history." He switched to another photo on his tablet, this one showing before and after images of the restoration. "I used a technique called fuming, exposing the new wood to ammonia vapors, just like craftsmen did a century ago. It doesn't just color the surface, it changes the wood itself, helping it blend seamlessly with pieces that have aged naturally." A mother in the front row leaned forward. "Is that why you still had sawdust all over you? Because you were working on something that couldn't wait?" Tom nodded, brushing absently at his sleeve. "Today's emergency was a family heirloom, a table that's seen 4 generations of family dinners, homework sessions, and holiday gatherings. When something carries that much history, you don't just fix it, you preserve its story." He glanced at Sophie, who was practically glowing with pride. "You know, my daughter once asked me why I don't use more power tools to work faster, but sometimes the old ways are the best ways. When I'm hand-planing a piece of wood, I can feel every grain, every variation. It's like reading Braille. The wood tells me what it needs." Another child raised their hand. "Can you make anything from wood?" "Well," Tom chuckled, "I once had to make a custom cat tree for a client whose Persian cat refused to use anything store-bought. Spent weeks studying that cat's climbing habits before I even picked up a tool. The cat approved, by the way. Hasn't scratched the furniture since." The laughter that followed was genuine, and Tom could feel the atmosphere in the auditorium shifting. Parents who had initially seemed dismissive were now engaged, several taking notes. One father in a business suit was examining his wooden watch with new interest. "But perhaps the most important thing about woodworking," Tom continued, his voice softening, "is that it teaches us patience. In a world where everything is instant and disposable, working with wood reminds us that some things can't be rushed. A tree takes decades to grow, and when we turn it into something useful or beautiful, we owe it the respect of taking our time." He pulled up one final photo, a music box he'd made for Sophie's last birthday. The intricate inlay work caught the light, drawing appreciative murmurs from the audience. "This piece took me 3 months to complete," he explained. "Each tiny piece of wood was selected for its color and grain pattern, cut precisely, and fitted together like a puzzle. But more than that, it was made with love, with stories, with time. And that's something no machine can replicate." The silence that fell over the auditorium now was different from the awkward hush at the beginning. It was the silence of appreciation, of understanding. Even the most polished professionals in the room were looking at their surroundings differently, noticing the craftsmanship in the wooden stage, the carved moldings, the solid doors. Sophie's voice piped up from the front row. "Tell them about the secret compartments, Dad." And just like that, Tom Anderson, covered in sawdust, marked by honest work, had transformed from an awkward presence to a keeper of mysteries, a curator of stories written in wood grain and joinery. The turning point had come not from hiding who he was, but from embracing it fully, sawdust and all. "Secret compartments," echoed several children in unison, their eyes wide with wonder. Even the parents who had been maintaining professional distance leaned forward in their seats, suddenly as curious as their children. Tom smiled, setting down his piece of burled maple and brushing some sawdust from his tablet. You know, throughout history, woodworkers haven't just been craftsmen. They've been magicians of sorts. We can make solid wood seem to disappear, create drawers that only open when you know the secret, and hide entire spaces in plain sight. He swiped to a new photo on his tablet, showing an elegant desk he'd crafted for Dr. Garcia's home office. Take this desk, for example. Can anyone spot the hidden compartment? The children crowded forward, some standing on their knees to get a better look. Dr. Garcia himself adjusted his glasses, studying the image with new interest. I've been using that desk for months, Dr. Garcia admitted, and I had no idea it had a secret compartment. Tom's eyes twinkled. That's because it has 3. One opens when you align the grain patterns just right. Another requires pressing 2 specific points simultaneously. And the third? He paused for effect. Well, maybe we should keep some secrets. The children erupted in excited chatter, and several parents pulled out their phones to take pictures of the desk displayed on Tom's tablet. Mrs. Williams, who had been standing at the side of the stage, was now smiling broadly. But it's not just about hiding things, Tom continued, warming to his subject. Every piece of furniture can tell a story if you know how to read it. See these dovetail joints? He zoomed in on a detail of the desk. They're cut by hand, the same way they were cut centuries ago. Each one is slightly different, like a signature. That's how you can tell a piece was crafted by human hands rather than machines. A businessman in the third row raised his hand. I have an antique secretary desk that's been in my family for generations. The drawers have started sticking. Would that be something you could look at? Before Tom could answer, another parent chimed in. Oh, and what about water damage? My grandmother's hope chest got caught in that flood last spring. Tom held up his dust-covered hands with a gentle laugh. This is exactly why I look like this today. Every piece of furniture that comes into my shop brings its own story, its own emergency. That family table I was working on before coming here? It wasn't just about fixing broken wood. It was about preserving 4 generations of family memories. He switched to another photo, this one showing the restoration process of an old rocking chair. Sometimes my job is like being a doctor for furniture. See this chair? It came to me in pieces held together with duct tape and prayers. The owner's great-grandmother had rocked 3 generations of babies in it. Replacing it wasn't an option. It needed to be healed, not replaced. The audience was fully engaged now, the initial discomfort about his dusty appearance completely forgotten. Children were pointing at details in the photos. Parents were taking notes. And even the investment banker who had presented earlier was examining the wooden armrest of his auditorium seat with new appreciation. The amazing thing about wood, Tom continued, running his calloused hand over the burled maple, is that it's never truly dead. It moves with the seasons, expands and contracts with temperature and humidity. That's why old houses creak at night. They're adjusting, settling, telling their stories. A young girl in a science club t-shirt raised her hand. Is that why my bedroom door sticks in summer? Exactly. Tom's face lit up. Wood is hygroscopic. It absorbs and releases moisture. In summer, wood swells with humidity. Understanding this isn't just carpentry. It's physics, chemistry, even a bit of meteorology. The science teacher in the back of the auditorium nodded approvingly. Several children were now writing in their notebooks, and Tom could hear whispers of hygroscopic being repeated with fascination. But perhaps the most magical thing about woodworking, Tom said, his voice softening, is how it connects us through time. When I restore a piece of furniture, I'm not just working with wood. I'm touching the same surfaces that craftsmen touched generations ago. I'm solving puzzles they left behind, learning from their techniques, and carrying their knowledge forward. He glanced at Sophie, who was beaming with pride. And sometimes, I get to pass these secrets on to the next generation. My daughter here can already identify 5 different types of wood by smell alone. 7, Sophie corrected from her seat, causing ripples of laughter. The atmosphere in the auditorium had transformed completely. What had started as polite tolerance had evolved into genuine fascination. Parents who had initially drawn back from Tom's sawdust were now inching closer, eager to see the details in his photos. Children who had been fidgeting were sitting still, captivated by the possibility of secret compartments and hidden stories in the wooden objects around them. Mrs. Williams stepped forward, about to signal that time was running out. But before she could speak, Dr. Garcia stood up. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his architect's portfolio forgotten in his lap, "I design buildings with the latest computer software and cutting-edge materials. But what you've shown us today, this connection between past and present, this preservation of stories, it's remarkable. Would you consider giving a demonstration at our firm's next design workshop?" Tom blinked in surprise, leaving a smudge of sawdust on his forehead as he rubbed it in amazement. The same professionals who had looked at him with skepticism were now seeing him through new eyes, not as someone who merely worked with his hands, but as an artist, a historian, a keeper of stories and secrets. The transformation was complete. The sawdust that had seemed like a mark of shame now appeared more like the residue of magic, each particle a tiny testament to the stories he helped preserve and create. As the official presentation time drew to a close, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual polite applause and quick exit, parents and children began gathering around the stage. Tom found himself at the center of an impromptu workshop discussion, his tablet passing from hand to hand as people scrolled through his portfolio of work. "Mr. Anderson," called out a mother in a crisp business suit who had earlier brushed sawdust from her sleeve, "that antique cradle you restored in the photos. I have my great-grandmother's cradle in my attic. It's in pieces, but after seeing your work, the joints should be repairable," Tom responded, automatically reaching for a pencil from his shirt pocket to sketch on the back of a program. His rough fingers left slight sawdust marks on the paper as he drew. These old cradles were built with love and skill. They just need someone to listen to their stories again. A group of children had gathered around the piece of burled maple he'd brought, taking turns feeling its smooth surface and unique patterns. Jason, the boy who had asked about the treehouse, was explaining to his friends how the swirls in the wood were like nature's fingerprints. "Dad!" Sophie called out, tugging on his dusty sleeve. "Show them the thing with the wood shavings." Tom smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a long, continuous shaving from the morning's planing work. It curled like a ribbon, thin enough to be translucent. The children gasped as he held it up to the stage light, showing how the grain patterns created natural shadows. "This is from a piece of cherry wood," he explained, kneeling down to their level, not caring that his already dusty jeans were getting dirtier. When wood is worked with sharp tools and respect, it reveals its beauty in layers. Each shaving is like a page in the tree's diary. Dr. Garcia had moved closer, his architect's portfolio now tucked under his arm. "Tom, I've been thinking. That community center project I mentioned in my presentation, we've been looking for someone to handle the interior woodwork. After seeing your attention to detail and understanding of how wood interacts with space," more parents gathered around, questions flowing freely now. A teacher asked about the possibility of a woodworking demonstration for her science class to illustrate principles of force and friction. A local business owner wanted to discuss custom shelving for his new store. Even the investment banker approached, asking about the possibility of learning basic woodworking as a hobby. Mrs. Williams appeared at Tom's elbow, smiling warmly. "Mr. Anderson, would you consider being part of our ongoing career exploration program? The children could really benefit from understanding how craftsmanship connects to their other subjects: math, science, history." Tom ran a hand through his hair, forgetting about the sawdust and leaving a new streak across his forehead. "I'd be honored," he replied, genuinely moved. "Though I might need to clean up a bit more next time." "Oh, I don't know," Mrs. Williams laughed, gesturing to the engaged crowd around them. "I think the sawdust made quite an impression. Sometimes the best lessons come from seeing real work in action." Parents who had barely nodded to each other before were now exchanging contact information, discussing the wooden pieces in their homes that needed attention. Tom found himself drawing quick sketches on programs, business cards, even a paper napkin someone had pulled from their lunch bag, explaining joints and techniques to an eager audience. "Mr. Anderson," a quiet voice said. He turned to find a shy-looking girl holding up a small wooden box. "My grandpa made this before he died, but it's broken. Mom said we should just buy a new one, but—" Tom carefully took the box, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the loose hinge. "Your grandpa put love into every joint of this box," he said softly. "We don't throw away love. Bring it to the workshop tomorrow. We'll help it tell its story for another generation." Sophie had been bouncing between groups, proudly adding details to her father's explanations. "Dad once fixed a rocking horse that was over 100 years old," she announced to anyone who would listen. "And he lets me help sand sometimes, when I wear my special workshop apron." The afternoon sun slanted through the auditorium windows, catching the floating particles of sawdust in the air and turning them golden, like tiny stars drifting around the gathered crowd. What had started as a simple career day presentation had transformed into something more, a reminder that in a world of mass production and quick replacements, there was still room for craftsmanship, patience, and the stories old wood could tell. As Tom sketched another joint detail for an interested parent, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. He was still covered in sawdust, his clothes still bore the marks of honest work, but somehow it no longer mattered. The same sawdust that had seemed like a source of embarrassment now felt like a badge of honor, each particle a tiny testament to the preservation of stories, the creation of beauty, and the connection between generations. Mrs. Thompson appeared at the back of the crowd, waving to catch his attention. "The table looks wonderful," she called out, "though now my husband is wondering if you could look at his grandfather's old writing desk, too." The ripple of laughter that followed was warm and genuine, the sound of a community recognizing one of its own, not just as a carpenter, but as a keeper of memories, a preserver of stories, an artist whose medium happened to be the living history of wood. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows as Tom and Sophie made their way back in after the presentation. The familiar scent of wood and varnish welcomed them home, mixing with the fresh autumn air drifting through the open door. Tom's old truck had left twin trails of dust in the driveway, marking their return to their own world of sawdust and stories. "Dad, you were amazing!" Sophie exclaimed for perhaps the 20th time since they'd left the school. She twirled around the workshop, her backpack still bouncing, carefully avoiding the stacks of lumber and works in progress she knew by heart. "Did you see everyone's faces when you showed them the secret compartments? And when you explained about the tree rings?" Even Dr. Garcia wanted to learn more. Tom smiled, hanging up his dust-covered jacket on its familiar hook. The workshop looked different somehow, as if the pride in his daughter's eyes had cast a new light on everything. The carefully organized tools, the projects in various stages of completion, even the sawdust-covered floor that he'd meant to sweep that morning. "You know what the best part was?" Sophie continued, perching on her special stool by the workbench, the one Tom had made for her 6th birthday, with her name carved in flowing script along the side. "Everyone could see what I see every day. How you don't just fix things, you make them special, again." Tom picked up the piece of burled maple they'd brought back from the presentation, turning it over in his hands. The swirling patterns caught the late afternoon light, creating shadows that danced across his workbench. "I was worried, you know," he admitted softly, "about showing up looking like this, about not being as impressive as the other parents." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "But that's what made it perfect. You were real, like when you tell me not to pretend to be something I'm not." She hopped down from her stool and hugged him, not minding the sawdust that transferred to her own clothes. "Besides, you got the most questions at the end, even more than that banker guy who talked about money stuff." Tom chuckled, remembering how the initial awkwardness had transformed into genuine interest. He walked over to the Thompsons' table, which sat waiting for its final carved details. Running his hand along the repaired leg, he could barely feel the joint where the break had been, a testament to years of practice and patience. "Hey, Princess," he called to Sophie, who was examining the latest addition to her collection of interesting wood scraps. "Want to help me finish this carving? You can work on the grape leaves while I do the vines." Sophie's face lit up. She rushed to get her own small apron, a miniature version of his, complete with pockets sized for her growing collection of tools. As she carefully tied it on, Tom was struck by how natural she looked in the workshop, how at home among the tools and wood shavings. "Remember what you told me about the grain?" she asked, selecting a small carving tool with the confidence of someone who had been taught to respect both the tools and their potential for danger. "Always follow the story it's trying to tell," they said together, sharing a smile that spoke of countless hours spent in this space, learning and creating together. As they worked side by side, the afternoon light growing softer, Tom reflected on the day's journey, from the morning's rush to the emergency repair, from his embarrassment at his appearance to the unexpected appreciation of his craft. Every moment had led to this quiet time with his daughter, sharing the knowledge and love of woodworking that had been passed down through generations. "Dad?" Sophie's voice was thoughtful as she carefully shaped a tiny leaf. "Jason asked if his dad could come learn about woodworking sometime. Could you maybe teach them? Like, you teach me?" Tom paused in his carving, considering. The workshop had always been their special space, a sanctuary of creativity and craftsmanship, but today had shown him that perhaps these walls held more stories that needed sharing. "You know what?" he replied, brushing a curl of wood from his work. "That's not a bad idea. Maybe we could start a weekend workshop. You could be my assistant instructor." Sophie beamed, sitting up straighter on her stool. "I could show them how to tell different woods by smell and how to find the secret patterns in the grain." The enthusiasm in her voice reminded Tom of the children's faces during his presentation, how they had leaned forward, eager to learn about the magic hidden in wood. He looked around his workshop with new eyes, seeing not just his own space, but a place where new stories could begin. A gentle knock at the workshop door interrupted their work. Mrs. Thompson stood there, smiling at the scene before her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, "but I wanted to drop off some cookies. A thank you for saving our table, and for reminding us that some things are worth preserving." As Sophie eagerly accepted the cookies, careful to hold them away from her dusty apron, Tom realized something profound. His workshop wasn't just a place where he fixed broken furniture. It was a place where he preserved memories, created new ones, and passed on the stories written in wood grain and joint work to the next generation. The sawdust that had seemed like a mark of shame this morning now glittered in the late afternoon sun like golden powder, each mote a tiny testament to work done with pride and purpose. His calloused hands, the stains on his clothes, the tools worn smooth with use. These weren't things to hide, but badges of honor in a world that too often valued shine over substance. "Hey, Dad," Sophie called, already back at her carving, cookie crumbs mixing with sawdust on her apron. "Tell me again about how trees remember everything in their rings?" Tom picked up his carving tool, ready to share another lesson, another story. In this moment, covered in the honest dust of his craft, teaching his daughter the magic of creating with her hands, he had never felt more proud to be exactly who he was, a keeper of stories written in wood. The next morning dawned crisp and clear in Maple Valley, the autumn sun casting long shadows through the workshop windows. Tom stood at his workbench, putting the finishing touches on Thompson's table. The carved grape vines, completed with Sophie's help the evening before, wound their way around the repaired leg, telling their own story of restoration and renewal. Sophie's small additions to the carving, slightly less precise but full of heart, had actually enhanced the piece, making it uniquely special. Some might see the subtle differences in technique as imperfections, but Tom knew they were something far more valuable. They were proof that craftsmanship, like all important things in life, was meant to be passed down, shared, and made personal by each new generation that embraced it. The morning light caught the grain of the wood, highlighting where old met new, where breaks had been mended, where father and daughter had worked together to make something broken whole again. It was more than just a repair job now. It was a testimony to the power of working with your hands, of taking the time to do things right, of seeing beauty in the marks left by honest work. Dad. Sophie's voice rang through the workshop as she burst in, still in her pajamas despite the early hour. Look what I found in my backpack. She held up a stack of papers, notes and drawings from her classmates, all inspired by yesterday's presentation. Tom wiped his hands on his apron and knelt down to look. There were careful sketches of tree rings, attempts to draw the swirling patterns of burled wood, and even some creative designs for secret compartments. One student had written a story about a magical carpenter who could speak to trees and learn their secrets. Jason's dad called this morning, Sophie continued excitedly. He wants to know when you're starting those weekend workshops. And Mrs. Williams emailed Mom about having you give a demonstration during Science Week, something about the physics of wood movement and structural integrity. Tom smiled, remembering how differently things had turned out from what he'd feared. His dusty appearance, which had seemed like such a liability, had ended up being the most authentic way to share his craft. It showed everyone, parents and children alike, that real work, meaningful work, sometimes meant getting your hands dirty. The workshop phone rang, and Tom answered it to find Dr. Garcia on the line. The architect spoke enthusiastically about incorporating more traditional woodworking elements into his modern designs, about bringing back the human touch to contemporary architecture. They scheduled a meeting to discuss collaboration on future projects, two craftsmen from different worlds finding common ground in the appreciation of authentic work. As he hung up the phone, Tom caught sight of himself in the workshop window. He was already covered in a fine layer of sawdust, his clothes bearing the honest marks of his craft. But instead of feeling self-conscious, he felt proud. Every speck of dust, every stain, every callus on his hands told a story of something created, something preserved, something made better through patient work and dedication. "Hey, Princess," he called to Sophie, who was organizing her growing collection of wood samples. "Remember what you said yesterday about being real?" She nodded, carefully labeling a piece of oak with its age and origin. "Well, I think that's what yesterday was really all about. Not just about woodworking, but about being proud of who you are and what you do. About understanding that real value isn't in looking perfect, it's in being authentic, in doing work that matters." Sophie looked up at him with wise eyes. "Like how every piece of wood is different, and that's what makes it special." "Exactly." Tom picked up a piece of wood from his workbench, an offcut from the Thompson's table repair. "See these marks? Some might call them imperfections, but they're really character marks. They tell us about the tree's journey, about the challenges it faced and overcame. Just like people." The workshop was filled with the morning light now, dust motes dancing in the golden beams like tiny stars. Outside, they could hear Maple Valley coming to life, cars heading to offices, children walking to school, the world moving at its usual fast pace. But here, time moves differently. In here, patience was still a virtue, craft was still an art, and every piece of wood held stories waiting to be discovered. Tom looked around his workshop, at the tools passed down through generations, at the projects waiting to be completed, at his daughter already showing signs of becoming a craftsperson in her own right. He thought about all the parents and children who had seen something special yesterday, something real and valuable in a world often too focused on surface appearances. "You know what, Sophie? I think we've got some work to do. This workshop has too many stories to keep to ourselves." She grinned, already reaching for her apprentice apron. "Can we start with Jason and his dad? I want to show them how to find the secret patterns in wood grain." Tom nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction settle over him like a warm blanket. Yesterday's presentation hadn't just changed how others saw his work. It had reminded him of something important. In a world of quick fixes and disposable everything, there was still profound value in working with your hands, in taking the time to do things right, in passing down knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or screens alone. As he and Sophie began laying out tools for their first informal weekend workshop, Tom realized that the sawdust that covered them both wasn't just the residue of their work. It was a badge of belonging to something bigger than themselves. It was proof that some things were still best learned through doing, through trying and failing and trying again, through getting your hands dirty and your heart involved in the work. In the end, it wasn't just about woodworking. It was about authenticity, about finding pride in honest work, about passing down not just skills, but values. It was about understanding that true craftsmanship, like true character, shows itself not in spite of its marks and scars, but because of them. And as father and daughter worked side by side in the sawdust-filled morning light, they were doing more than just working with wood. They were crafting a legacy, one careful cut, one shared story, one preserved piece of history at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.